Well, this morning we've gone from Islam to petroleum and then some, and then to the embassy. And this afternoon we are going to talk about whether or not the Middle East is different after the demise of Mr. bin Laden. Our speaker is Frank Anderson, President and CEO of the Middle East Policy Council and a partner of the MITA Group, which provides public affairs and management consulting services to the U.S. and international commercial and government clients. Prior to his 14-year consulting career, Mr. Anderson served in the Central Intelligence Agency for 26 years. He served 3 tours of duty in the Middle East as an agency station chief, headed the Afghan Task Force 1987-89, and was chief of the Near East and South Asia Division. He has contributed to a number of publications, including Middle East Policy, Gaddafi's Libya, The Limits of Optimism, has been interviewed on the BBC, CNN, all of the major media outlets, and has participated in numerous panel discussions and conferences regarding the Middle East and South Asia. He served in the U.S. Army in Korea and received a BA from the University of Illinois and graduated from the U.S. Foreign Service Institute of Arabic Language and Area Studies. Please join me in welcoming Frank Anderson.
All right, how is the region different after the death of Osama bin Laden? First thing I'd like to point out is that Osama bin Laden couldn't have been a very happy man in his last days. He was holed up in not a windowless house, but he pretty much had to live a windowless existence. You saw on television the sparse life that he led, and despite his ascetic apparent desire to have a pure lifestyle, he couldn't have been very comfortable. One of the reasons he couldn't have been very happy is that Al-Qaeda as an organization was pretty well devastated well before he was killed. A lot of things were happening. One, there had been security and military success across the board. The leadership of Al-Qaeda had been repeatedly, it's sort of like mowing the grass. I can't remember somebody's line that the most dangerous job in the world was to be the number 3 man at Al-Qaeda, because we kept killing that guy. But others stood up. But the other thing that was happening was increasingly widespread revulsion in the region with a lot of the things about Al-Qaeda. Even jihadists question the value of killing women and children. There was a loss of real safe haven in Afghanistan, increasing military pressure on them. The Taliban, about whom we speak, is definitely not a single organization. There are some, I've lost count, and I've spent a good bit of the last year in Afghanistan, whether there are 6 or 7 separate elements of the insurgency in Afghanistan. But very few of them would argue that their fight is to continue to have the right to provide shelter to Al-Qaeda. At home, got to remember home, and the main target for Osama bin Laden was Saudi Arabia. Remarkable successes against his organization and against his ideology. There's been since May of 2003, Saudi Arabia has been engaged in really a civil war. Thousands of their citizens have been arrested, hundreds tried, hundreds killed, and Al-Qaeda in Saudi Arabia is pretty much gone. The remnants of that population, organization, subculture, whatever you want to call it, have taken haven in Yemen, where it's difficult for us to deal with them, but it's also not a very pleasant or easy place. It's not a pleasant place to live if you're on the lam. It's not an easy place from which to project power. Inside Saudi Arabia, separate from Osama bin Laden, but part of it is just the passage of time has made this the case. Certainly, Saudi Arabia's current king is one of the best in their history and had a great line saying that these people, meaning the rejectionist or takfiri, I'll go back to what that word takfiri means in a bit. Extremists call themselves Salafis, meaning that they wish to go back to an Islam at its salaf, at its roots. Trouble is they haven't really accurately studied what the roots of Islam are. And what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has done is taken one of the princes. We'll talk about this later. It's an issue where policy and security and military policy tends to be prince-centric. But a single prince is in charge of the paramilitary law enforcement attack on Salafi jihadists in Saudi Arabia, in charge of educational reform, and in charge of religious reform. And it is a program that's had substantial success. So Al-Qaeda is, or Osama bin Laden in his last days, was living a miserable existence, was looking at his organization largely destroyed, of total failure in the place that most mattered to him was Saudi Arabia, and now operating in the places that they can operate and reside, the wild northwest frontier of Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia. And the residual threat from Al-Qaeda is not from that organization, but it's from franchisees, I guess. Individuals or small groups around the world that probably most often from internet searches come up with the ideology and maybe the tactics to mount individual attacks that around the world have been decreasingly bloody and therefore from their point of view decreasingly successful. Takfiri, the word, Ayman Zawahiri, the new leader of Al-Qaeda, is an Egyptian. The organization that he came from and was part of before he went to prison, the organization that murdered Anwar Sadat, was called Takfir wa Hijra. And takfir is an Arabic word meaning to make a thing or a person an infidel. And hijra is the word for emigration. In Islamic religion, it marks the time that Muhammad emigrated from Mecca to Medina because the people in Mecca had rejected his message. In jihadi ideology, it is that pure Muslims and jihadists need to move away from a corrupt and westernized society, and the takfir is the thing that is most objectionable to most faithful Muslims, and a religion that says your relationship with God, even more than Christianity, is a personal thing. Islam is one person's surrender to the will of God. But takfiris are saying, no, we, the pure, are able to identify and declare who is or who is not a true Muslim and put them on a hit list. that ideology is failing. It was, in fact, failing badly well before 9/11. 9/11 was planned in Afghanistan. Osama bin Laden was there. Ayman Zawahiri was there because they had been run out of their home countries. By 1997, the most radical part of the Egyptian jihadist movement declared a ceasefire with the Egyptian government and participated first actually in its own and then in cooperation with the government in a systematic process of de-radicalization that took, this is from one scholar's line, 15 to 20,000 Islamic group. It's the organization to which Zawahiri belonged before he left, away from the Salafi jihadi camp. 1997 was also the time that there was another ceasefire declared in Algeria between what was called the Algerian Salvation Front and the armed Algerian group. A similar ceasefire between radicals in Tajikistan. The Saudi Arabia civil war didn't really get kicking until after 2003, but it was almost the last of an across the region reasonably successful attack on radicals. More important, in terms of the unhappiness of Osama bin Laden in the last days of his life, was what's been called the Arab Spring. There wasn't anybody on Tahrir Square calling for takfir wa hijr. That narrative wasn't there. I'm going to go back to narratives because narratives in the Middle East have gotten them very little progress in the last century or so. The fundamental political narrative of the 19th and much of the 20th century was anti-European colonialism. Was the narrative that said, we're backward, we're disadvantaged, and the reason is that we have suffered from the exploitation and the oppression of European colonialists. Not a baseless accusation. Nevertheless, focusing on that for political motivation and organization led the region, or much of the region, down two dead ends. They lined up with the losing side in two great struggles in the 20th century. They lined up with National Socialism in the 30s and 40s, not because they were anti-Semitic, not because they wanted to see Germans ruling all of Europe, but because the Germans were against the Brits. Much of what became anti-Americanism in the Middle East was because we were with the Brits and with the French. But that anti-imperialist narrative in the 30s, 40s lined them up with the losing side. Never a smart thing to do. From the 1950s, well into the 80s and 90s, the political narrative of anti-imperialism lined them up with the losing side in the Cold War. Those narratives didn't work. It kind of set the stage for the takfir wa hijr narrative, which is, it wasn't just European colonialism that got us, but it was the betrayal of Arab regimes, and specifically the Saudis and the Hashemites in Iraq, Jordan, and the Saudis in Saudi Arabia, before actually any of those countries were created, and lining up with European imperialism against the Ottomans in World War I, which, according to bin Laden and Ayman Zawahiri, opened the way for not just European imperialism, but anti-Islamic imperialism, having defeated the last caliphate. And the only way to deal with this is through violent rejection of all these regimes. We have to kill our way out of this problem. It was once again a narrative that put them on the losing side. I won't go back again over all the factors that by 9/11, they were on the losing side all across the region. Now their new narratives are taking hold. The youth of the region and others are turning around saying what really should matter to us is governance, good governance. I want to live in a country where there's rule of law. I want to live in a country where I can count upon the government to enforce contracts, to protect me from thieves, not to be a thief. I simply want to have decent government. I don't want to be led by a socialist. I don't want to be led by a national, I don't want to be led by a national socialist. I don't want to be led by a scientific socialist. I don't want to be led by a Takfiri radical. I want to be led by somebody that'll get the garbage picked up and the mail delivered and keep burglars from getting into my house and certainly not be the burglars, which is occasionally the issue. That's a new and not yet successful narrative, but it's going in that direction. Let me go across the places and give you a very, not cynical, but realistic estimate of what's likely to happen in the near term, in the Arab Spring. Tunisia, where it began, in fact, was always pretty much a decent, relatively happy little place compared to the rest of the Arab world, that in 2 generations of leadership, first the Bourguiba first president, and then Ben Ali, started out with good governance and a good leader who married a rapacious woman and forced the ruling family into a kleptocracy. And then there was a revolution, or at least first was a military coup led by Ben Ali, who improved things for a while, and then married another woman that caused him to start stealing. Well before I took a story from my youth, before I took a political science course to understand politics, I served as an 18-year-old in Korea in April of 1960 when the Koreans rose up in a series of mostly student-led riots against the government of Syngman Rhee and overthrew it. A couple soldiers, I was in a company that had a lot of Korean troops in it. There were Korean Army troops assigned to the U.S. Army. And my closest friend, a corporal named Bak Young-hee, went AWOL with 3 of his friends to participate in these demonstrations that led to the fall of Syngman Rhee. And he was quite, as were his colleagues, lucky that the government went down. Otherwise, his life in the army would have been more difficult when they started tracking down those participants. But it worked out on his side. In July of 1960, they had the first elections. We had organized ourselves so that Americans would do all of the work that Koreans would normally do, and there were Americans in all the positions on the front lines, and the Koreans we'd organize it so they could go back and vote. I came around this tent that we lived in, and there was my friend Bak Young-yi sitting on his haunches smoking a cigarette. And I looked at him and I said, Bak, you missed the truck. Why do I want to get on the truck? I said, you have to go home and vote. Using a pidgin English, Bak said to me, Anderson, all honcho slicky boys. All chiefs are thieves. He says, what does it matter to Baki who steals from it? I looked at him, I said, Bak, you know, I'm giving him the American 8th grade civics lesson, and he said, and you risked your life to get rid of Syngman Rhee. He held up his hand and said, Syngman Rhee stole too much. One way to look at the Arab Spring in Tunisia and in Egypt is that Ben Ali, Mubarak, they were getting around to stealing way too much. And they pushed it. Another way to look at it, it is true that this is a new generation. It's really tough in the world of satellite communications to maintain the monopoly on information that is required to maintain an autocratic regime. Makes it tough. I'm going to read a line, on the other hand, about the youth that are involved in this. And it was the organizers, this is from my friend John Altman, who runs the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The organizers of the recent protests of Egypt and elsewhere displayed the skills and savvy of U.S. politicians running for office. They used the internet to advertise their agenda, to rally the masses and build solidarity. To reach the disconnected, they provided fodder for television stations and paraded through poor neighborhoods, strategically adjusting their emphasis from better politics to better paychecks. Yet for all their creativity and dynamism in the months following, they've struggled to make the leap from advocacy to policy making. It's kind of tough when you have to do the real work. The so-called Facebook kids spurred faceless revolutions with no clear leaders or platforms to fill the void. And in this context, what I think you're going to see first in Tunisia and then in Egypt is reformed and better, improved versions of the current government. But the security-centric governments in those countries are not going to go away. They're going to stay in place and get better and be more responsive. And it will be some time to see whether or not we get a replay. I think it won't be as easy for the next Mrs. President to say it's time to start stealing from the people. In Egypt, it's already clear that the military council governing the country is not going to allow a revolution. The strategic-centric, or I'm sorry, the security-centric administration of Egypt, which I would argue has really only evolved since Pharaonic times. In Libya and in Syria, it's gone violent. Libya is really hard to predict. So a line I muttered to my son a couple months ago, and it was, you know, the game used to be fixed all throughout the Arab world. So you knew how to bet. Now we don't have how to bet until, or we don't know who's going to win until there's actually a game and where the score's going to go. I don't believe that the Gaddafi regime has a chance of survival, but there's an open question I mean, one of the problems of decapitating a regime is you don't know, or you don't have someone with whom to negotiate the transfer of power. And Libya is, many of us have forgotten this, Gaddafi and I are almost the same age. He's 2 months younger than I. And both of us are 9 years younger than modern Libya. The nation state of Libya, originally the Kingdom of Libya, was created by a United Nations program led primarily by the US and the UK in 1951 that put together 3 quite disparate regions. And all of the reasons they were disparate regions in 1951 still exist. And when I listen to people from, not all, but some of the more prominent merchant families, not radicals, certainly not friends of Gaddafi from Tripoli, talking about the good news that's coming from Benghazi, the line is, we didn't want to be ruled by Gaddafi. Why would we be pleased at the prospect of being ruled by Gaddafi's butler, his former Minister of Justice, and a group of people, the Tripolitanians were ruled too long by Italians because they come up with a word called the Benghazini, those people from Benghazi. I don't know how that's going to work. I would urge you not to listen to people who say that Al-Qaeda is going to take over. Not likely. But I don't know what's going to happen, and I worry about with the absence of a mechanism or a way to negotiate and end what those final weeks are going to look like in Tripoli. We did in Syria. Syria's a problem because Egypt, Tunisia, and even Libya with a little help from the rest of the world, balked at the idea of machine gunning their people in the thousands. The Syrian regime may not balk at that. So I don't know how that one's going to go out. And the rest of the world is running out of resources and I think is probably already run out of appetite to stop the regime from doing what it might do. So Syria might not be as happy and ending. But otherwise, things are across the region getting better. One of the paradoxes of the Arab world, and this is a line I've used for years and I'm modifying it slightly, with the exception of Lebanon, which is really a 1920s kind of Chicago gangster state, and Algeria, which is an autocratic oligarchy that's clinging to 1960s socialism way too long. Every nation in the Arab world is really a monarchy. There's one guy in charge, or has been. Tunisia and Egypt, they're deciding who it's going to be. But they're monarchies, and increasingly they were even becoming hereditary monarchies. Some of those monarchies are honest enough to call themselves kingdoms, sultanates, or emirates, and others pretend to be republics, democratic popular republics, and a thing that was Gaddafi's called the Jamahiriya, which just could be translated as mass rule, but the word also could be translated as mob rule. And governance, when I talked about this demand of people to have a government that enforces contracts and picks up the stuff on the trash on the street and paves the streets, make sure electricity is delivered, is across the board better in the monarchies that are honestly kingdoms. if people going across, if people have to decide whether they would rather live in Algeria or Morocco, they all say Morocco, well, except for the Algerians, obviously, yes. But if you ask a Tunisian or a Syrian, would you rather live in Algeria or Morocco? Morocco. Would you rather live in Jordan or Syria? Syria. Would you rather live in Iraq or Saudi Arabia? And this goes back before we kind of broke things in Iraq. The answer would be Saudi Arabia. Now it's definitely Saudi Arabia. The Gulf states, now that we've done with the monarchies, and there's, Jordan, Morocco. Morocco's actually way ahead on reform, taking a major chance at moving toward a parliamentary democracy in which I can promise you the royal family and its entourage will not give up security control. But Morocco's always been pretty good at having a pretty vigorous democracy, multi-party political system that argues things about who picks up the trash and who gets the roads done. And since I was raised in Chicago, I understand who gets the patronage as well. The Gulf states have few problems, really, states. They've got fewer people and lots of money. Bahrain's an exception, but it's a tiny exception. They sometimes claim to have 1.5 million people. It's closer to about 500,000. And they have a problem. And their problem is that one religious and ethnic group has all the benefits, and another religious and ethnic group was doing all the work. And they were tired of it, and there have been riots. I'm old enough to remember what the United States went through when a disadvantaged minority got tired of it in the 1950s and 60s, and the National Guard and the 82nd Airborne Division had to go to Chicago's Detroit, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and here in Washington, D.C., until we began to make progress. Bahrain, because they're surrounded by a whole lot of people with money, are probably going to have the means to make that kind of progress. But whether or not they'll have the skill depends on some adjustments in the royal family. I'll go back to this 1960s United States in our civil rights struggle and some comparisons. There is a young, reform-minded chief of state. And there is an older, very much not refined, a reform-minded guy in charge of national and internal security. And that's a relationship that's not too much like John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson on the young, reform-minded side and J. Edgar Hoover on the other. The world is not all that different. There have been great improvements in education, huge investments in the Gulf. Most of the countries in the Arab world, in fact, already put more money into education than they do military. Their investments, some in issues of quality, but also an overemphasis on humanities as opposed to science and engineering, is producing, and it's one of the other problems that was happening in Egypt and Tunisia, an educated middle class that had degrees in law and political science and economics and religious studies, and there weren't any jobs for that outside the government. I think you're all teachers. Are you noticing that as a problem here? There are still daunting problems for this region. Biggest one, a lot of people, not a lot of money, not a lot of water. So even the new regimes, with the best of intentions, populated by well-educated bureaucrats and technocrats, will have a big problem dealing with the fact that there are just a lot of people for not a lot of stuff. Egypt is stagnated on that. Yemen is a tragedy on the way to happening. Yemen's got a huge population. They were able to deal with it for a long time because they exported labor. The majority of military-age males in Saudi Arabia up until 1990 were Yemenis, who were there doing temporary and usually crummy work. Then Ali Abdullah Saleh, the president in Yemen, made the mistake of picking the Iraqi side in the first Gulf War, and the Saudis expelled all the Yemenis. The other thing that was giving Yemen a bit of a break was they'd found some oil. Money always helps. They've run out of places to export their labor. They're running out of oil certainly within the next decade, maybe as early as the next 5 years. They will no longer have commercially valuable oil deposits. And worse than that, they're running out of water. So Yemen is about to be a disaster. It has nothing to do with Arab nationalism, has nothing to do with Salafi jihadism, has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda, has nothing to do with us. It's just about to be a disaster. There are historic conflicts that have nothing to do with us or little to do with us that are still there and are a problem for the region. Algeria and Morocco have been at either declared or undeclared war with each other almost since their independence. Over their view, Morocco was a conservative monarchy aligned with the United States. Algeria was a socialist revolutionary administration aligned with the Soviet Union. And since 1973 or 75, they've been fighting a proxy war over what used to be the Spanish Sahara. The Algerians call it the Sahrawi Republic, and the Moroccans call it their Western Sahara province. There's the conflict and it's between Syria and Jordan. There's a conflict between Syria and Iraq, and these all predate the recent military conflicts. There's the fundamental conflict between Iran and all the Arabs, except Syria, but you can put that also in the Syrians are aligned with the Iranians, not because they love the Iranians, it's just because they hate the Iraqis and the Jordanians more. And there is the Arab-Israeli conflict. It is still a political motivator. Along with European imperialism, it's a century worth of humiliation for the Arab people and everywhere. It's amazing. You know, you can go find Moroccans who are the most pro-Israeli or the least anti-Israeli nation in the Arab world, but if you still scratch them, they're mad. And they're increasingly angry as the Arab-Israeli, I have a point of view which might not be widely shared, but I have the microphone, so I'll express it. One of the best ways to describe what's been happening on Arab-Israeli was one of the Palestinian negotiators through what used to be the peace process, it's now deader than a doornail, saying, you know, it's as though we've been negotiating over a pizza, but the other side keeps eating it. So there's less and less of the pizza to pass out. And that means there are fewer and fewer opportunities for peace. The United States and our political system is not doing well on this one. I had, for 20 years, remarked on the following paradox, and that was certainly since the late 80s, early 90s, you could take a poll in Israel and you could take a poll in, you can either call it Samaria and Judea, or you can call it the occupied territories, and you never got less than a plurality on both sides that said, we will take a deal that puts Israel back within roughly the 1967 borders, shares Jerusalem, and while none of them will admit it, deals with the refugees by the Americans paying them off. But despite the fact that both sides had populations that would support that, both sides had dysfunctional political systems that gave their rejectionist minorities a veto. So you couldn't get it done. I can't remember why or when it was it suddenly hit me that the reason we're not able to deal with it as well as the system needs us to deal with it is because we have a dysfunctional system that gives a veto to our rejectionist minority. And I have two things to say about that, and one of them is, and it's a story from my time in the agency dealing first with the Israelis who didn't trust me because in the beginning. And as I said in a meeting when I was first meeting the leadership of the Israeli intelligence and security services, here's what I can promise you, and that is on any given issue, I'll come down on the American side. No, this is going to be, I'll take a minute to say this fun moment. I've talked way too long. That came up, and that as that discussion went on, they asked me, finally, because the ice broke over the American sideline, he said, well, how do you find the differences in dealing with us and with them? I said, you're lots easier. They didn't like to hear that. Israelis don't want to think that they're easy to deal with. And I said, well, why is that? And I said, well, first, there's an issue of cultural resonance. As a matter of fact, Americans and Israelis are very similar people in their culture. So that's easy. It's easier, I sit down with you and I don't have to reach out, I don't have to figure your culture, it's there. Second, I work for a government that is always going to come down on your side. And everybody knows that, including people on the other side, so that's a tension when I'm dealing with them. I accepted that. And I said, third, no Israelis ever tried to kill me. To which he's a good friend of mine now, the then head of Mossad, said, yet, as far as you know. But I will describe these friends of mine in the context, I'll go get off of this Arab-Israeli thing with the fact that, this is a line I'm going to steal from Al Sharpton. It is time for Americans to stop listening to the Israeli right and to start listening to the right Israelis. Prominent leaders of the Israeli military and security services, scholars, the right Israelis, responded in one way while the Prime Minister of Israel was here poking the President of the United States in the eye and then went up to Capitol Hill and got applauded by our legislators, where the headline from one Israeli journalist was, it was like Bibi and the yo-yos. He'd say something, no matter how outrageous it was, they'd all stand up and clap. And he turned around and said, I will not go back to the indefensible 1967 borders. I encourage you to have your students and each of you take a look at an organization called Stratfor that looks at every problem in the world geopolitically. And George Friedman, I will note that's not an Irish name, the intellectual and administrative head of Stratfor, did a great pair of articles, one on the geopolitics of biblical and historical Israel, and another on, well, let's take a look at the defensiveness of these borders. Two things. It's a lot easier to defend the 67 borders. And for another historical things I will point out is that Israel had wars in 1948, 1956, and 1967, defending those 67 borders. They won all of those handily. Since then, they got into a scrap that they almost lost in 1973, briefly, until the United States we stripped tanks out of Europe. There were company commanders in Germany who were hiding tanks so that we could rearm the Israelis well enough. And they did a superb job then of defeating the Egyptian army. But it came close. And since then, repeated efforts in Lebanon, in Gaza, and trying to secure themselves in the West Bank, the Israelis have not won a fight. They've won a number of fights. They have not won a war. They're not more secure. They're less secure than they were before. We need to get down on the American side and help them out of that one. Well, then I will finish up, because we have real issues in our ability to deal with this. One of them is our credibility in the region is pretty much gone. Well, it's bad. That's probably way too strong. It's badly strained. The other one is we have done badly. There was a great story of the King of Saudi Arabia in the 1930s calling together the family and saying, we have to make a decision. You have to have a relationship with what we were then called great powers. I have to pick. Are we going to be a client of the British? Or are we going to be a client of the French, the Russians, the Germans, or the Americans? He said, well, here's what I found. Listening to the Bahrainis and the Iraqis. The Americans are really funny. They believe this thing about all men are created equal. And even if they don't believe it, they're embarrassed to admit in polite company that they might not believe it. So they treat us better than any of those others. If you think people in Mississippi are racist, go to Russia. Russians are not nice. Englishmen just can't treat an American Army officer put in a room with a Jordanian colonel or a Saudi colonel or a Malaysian colonel will react to that person because of the rank. He's a colonel. A Brit can't do that. He's a WOG colonel. The French can't do that. So the King of Saudi Arabia noted that. This is a really important one. He then noted that I talked to others, because the Bahrainis and the Iraqis, because they've also are looking to develop their oil. These Americans are technically competent. They get things done. They know how to do things, and they're good managers. I like that. Third, he said, they're the farthest away. So we're going with the Americans. Nobody regards us anymore as competent. Well, I take that back. Our competence has been called into question. I had a consulting business that almost tanked in 2002, early 2003, because as late as November 2002, I was telling my clients, we're not going to invade Iraq. That's too stupid. We invaded Iraq. By the way, every time, and I love this, on Capitol Hill, we've had this great success in Iraq upon which we must build in Afghanistan. Well, if you talk to Iraqis and if you look at things like child mortality, access to education, access to potable water, electrical production, any one of those measures, we haven't yet fixed Iraq. We invaded and broke the place in 1991. It took them 90 days to get back in business. We invaded and broke the place in 2003. It's now 2011. They're not back in business. And they're not secure. So people are questioning our competence. They're still now, for lots of reasons, questioning our goodwill. And the technology of the 21st century means nobody's far away. So we got a problem dealing with it. There are real issues that make us less competent. We don't have the resources, unsustainable deficits. You can't have a force protection foreign policy without national participation. We don't participate in paying taxes, and the fighting is done by a small, increasingly alienated, and to a small but nevertheless growing extent, embittered warrior caste that's separated from the rest of the society. There's a wisdom deficit. We don't have enough linguists. We don't have enough study of the region. I won't go into Islam bashing, but there's way too much hate mongering. And we have responded after being attacked, and it was bad, by forgetting that every person who goes to work for the government takes an oath first to defend the Constitution of the United States, and we've decided that all those freedoms are not nearly as important as security and counterterrorism. I think it was Benjamin Franklin, I'm not certain who said it, that a nation who opts for security over liberty deserves neither, and gets neither. And my line is, all of you are teachers, and at least once a day you make your kids stand up and sing a song that ends about the land of the free and the home of the brave, and every day we become less of each. And I'm done talking. Heidi, how much time do we have for questions? I really went over.
Well, we have a few minutes.
Okay.
Yes, my question is regarding, you gave kind of a prediction about the region. I was wondering if you could comment on the prospect of Iran and, and where they're going with regard to all the changes that have going about, I guess, since their 2009 election.
Yeah. Iran's another one where they have to play before I know what the score's going to be. The youth of the educated middle class like us better than they like their leaders, or they dislike their leaders less than they dislike us. It's not a nation of educated middle class people. So those who are not educated and not middle class, they haven't yet been heard from. And worse than that, the guns are all in the hands of the people on the other side, and I don't know. So politically, I don't know what's going to happen in Iran. The pressures are there. Good news from our point of view is that there was almost a quiet military coup last year. Ahmadinejad and the Islamic Revolutionary Guards started pushing the clerical leadership aside to take charge in what was really a kleptocracy that's every bit as bad as Tunisia was. Not because they like us, but the religious conservatives are pushing back, and they might contribute to a change that's not so much good for us, but less bad for us. But I don't know. In terms of the Iranian nuclear program, I was chief of the Iran branch as a young person in 1980. I got to go break helicopters in a desert, so I know what it is to have a terribly failed, or being part of a terribly failed military operation. But I also know from that time when I took it over, I had analysts, and I said, we have to talk about this as Iranian nuclear program, because it was not started by the mullahs, it was started under the Shah. And the analysts came in and said, they could have a bomb in 5 years. I went away and did a whole bunch of other things. In 1983, I was in charge of a couple of evaluation programs, talked to the analysts and said, what about this Iranian bomb? He said, they could have a bomb in 5 years. I'll go on with the story, but it keeps going. Now, maybe it's how long it'll be to have the fissile material, but most people say 1 to 5 years. They could have a bomb. So I'm less worried about the bomb. And the other side of it is, Colin Powell got it wrong. He made the comment in the 90s or 80s that Sunni terrorists are homicidal and Shia terrorists are suicidal. Iranians are not suicidal. And to have a nuclear weapon that you use as anything other than a bargaining chip is national suicide. And I don't think they'll do that. But that doesn't make it easy. And their possession of it will make life for us and for everybody around the region tough. And the Saudis and others are saying if they get it, we're going to get it. So it's ugly.
I was actually wondering, when this uprising happened, the Arab Spring, were there any NGOs involved, both within the countries, regionally, and maybe even in the Western world, like the United States, who helped the youth and those interested in the revolution at all, maybe morally, financially, emotionally, would you know?
If they were, I didn't notice it. I talked about my friend John Alterman at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who's just done a thing on the Arab Awakening, and one of the subject of the thing from which I just read is the requirement to build up in the Arab world think tanks, an NGO culture to support political change. It's a good piece. I recommend it to you. There's fledgling beginnings, but they're not there. And European and American NGOs have gotten dragged into, I encourage you to read a book by Ashraf Ghani called Fixing Failed States. He was an Afghan presidential candidate, but he, in 2004, whoever gives this grant, was judged the best foreign minister in the world. He was trying to get Afghanistan on a reasonable footing. And he does a good job of outlining the incompetence and the corruption of what's become the development industry. We don't do well at this. And it's getting worse. The Agency for International Development has ceded all its activities to what they call developmental partners, who are NGOs and contractors. And they're a program of careerism. It's careerism and profiteering, and very little gets done. But it's a good, it's something that needs civil society on both sides needs to be developed, and ours is going in the wrong direction.
Building on what you just said, and all of the news reports in these last 6 months from the government, from our government, about how we have to get aid in there to help them build civil societies all over the Arab world. One can't help but think perhaps it'd be better if we helped less, and but how how does one deal with this careerism in the industry of helping other countries build themselves up? The WikiLeaks thing that came out just last week about Haiti, and people in the government here are thinking, wow, this is going to be great. We'll make a lot of money on giving aid to Haiti that American NGOs will then earn in contracts and take right back out of Haiti. How did we get there? If you could do that really briefly, and then how do we change that that paradigm?
If I knew,
Well,
I would run up the Capitol Hill with the answer. Our government is dysfunctional. We have a $929 billion defense budget with a $1 trillion deficit. And our Army is small. And the Army itself, is a remarkably efficient killing machine. But the tooth is followed up by a tail that is, most of that $929 billion is landing somewhere within 20 miles of the Beltway, I think. Or no, it's not, because there are defense contractors all over the country. And we're not getting bang for our buck because we've outsourced government. And I've had this line, outsourcing the collection of trash makes sense in a lot of places. I'm worried about the outsourcing, privatization of water systems, which is happening because maybe that's something that people have a right to. But across the board, we've bitten into the idea that business is more efficient than government. And I've been in business and government, and I can tell you what's inefficient is any group with more than 6 people. And that group can be in government or it can be in private industry. If it's more than 6 people, it's going to be inefficient. At least the government has an ethic it still has an ethic of service. The responsibility, the ethic of a businessman is to deliver profit. And that's not rapacious or evil on this guy. That's his job or her job. And when that becomes the ethic, it's all distorted, and it's terribly distorted. It's just, we can talk about anecdote after anecdote about how it doesn't work.
So given that and all our budget constraints, what can we do? Like if you had to go to, if they actually listened to you, what would you recommend?
Wow.
Well, I'm sure
every once in a while my kids ask me, do you ever miss being a government big shot? I said, no, because if anybody asks me now how to fix it, I don't have an answer. And I truly don't. I mean, across the board, I would say, and I've come to this reluctantly and late, and that's coming to it after a good bit of time in the last year in Afghanistan. We've stopped being useful. It's time for us to back out slowly, or not slowly, deliberately, but we got to get out and make them just deal with it. And one of the reasons for that is, and it's a lesson that I should have learned a long time ago, but it was an insight developed a few years ago. Military force, I learned this at 18 and then I forgot it until I was 67, is only good for killing people and destroying property. I am not a pacifist. There are times when killing people and destroying property is appropriate. We're past that in Afghanistan. And if we back out, whatever emerges, including if it has substantial Taliban, is going to have stuff they don't want broken. And we'll be a lot more effective on the outside negotiating with them, saying, you don't want us to break your stuff? Let's talk about your policies. I think the wisest thing we could have done in Iraq, and Iraq is another one, get the hell out of there. First place, we never should have invaded. You know, the number of mistakes. A, we shouldn't have invaded because they were offering a surrender that got us 99% of what we wanted and 120% of what we needed. But we did invade. Once we got there, the idea that we would fire the army and the whole government, but that was the next chance we had, and that was before we fired the government, would have been Tommy Franks when they pulled down that statue on April the 9th. Stood there and got a microphone and said, this is what happens when you make us mad. Now we're going home. And like in 1991, I'll bet within 90 days, maybe 6 months, they would have been back in business and they would have had stuff they didn't want us to break. Now we're the ones that have the stuff, and they're breaking it. So I would figure out a way to deliberately get out of Afghanistan and deliberately get out of Iraq. I would recognize, I wasn't going to say this, but this is something I've said to my kids, and maybe this wouldn't be bad for teachers. The wisdom of a guy named M. Scott Peck, who wrote a book called The Road Less Traveled a long time ago. It's a sort of religious book, which I recommend, but I guess this isn't the place to recommend religion. It's not religious, it's spiritual tome. But he starts out, his first line in the book is, life is difficult. This is a great truth. Perhaps it is the greatest truth. Except that life is difficult, and my other line to my kids is, the difficulties come in two kinds. There are problems which we can solve. And you should, when you're confronted with a problem that you can solve it. Don't ignore it, because it'll get worse. But there are also situations with which you must cope. And if you can't define the difference between those two, and you start you waste time and effort on a situation with which you have to cope, you reduce your abilities to cope. You just waste those resources. And most of the world is coping. I mean, what we have to do with most of the world is coping. And we really screwed up for a while we began the 20th century with a small group of people in the White House and the Department of Defense who had an idea about solving the problem. And it hasn't worked. And we need to get smart enough to go back and cope. And sometimes that means we'll have to do things that don't make sense. Advance democracy by continuing to support monarchies who provide better government than people claim to be Democrats as they get better. And do other things that make sense rather than that are ideologically sensible. But this is now a civil thing. We have to go back, we have to tell our people that we have made a deal. The social contract in the United States is unfulfillable. A friend of mine asked me, I continue making money, so that's good, but up until the time, he said, let's add up how much money we have put into Medicare. And in my case, maybe I'm up to $30,000. And I've been working since I've been putting into Social Security, not Medicare, it wasn't there, but I've been putting into Social Security since I was 15. But I put maybe $30,000 into Medicare. I'm a prostate cancer survivor. My wife is a kidney transplant recipient. We eat up 30 grand a year. I have the means to contribute. I don't. My mother-in-law she's moved in with us because of dementia, lived in a house big enough to have an indoor swimming pool. She was enraged at the idea they might tax her Social Security. You know? So everybody on the left is going to have to turn around to their people and say, you're going to have to put up with less. And everybody on the right is going to have to say, you know, yes, it is true that the top 5% of the population pay something like 90% of the taxes. But they get more than 90% of the bennies, and getting them to tax some more. And the idea that a Goldman Sachs kid that's about to get $5 million bonuses, and this is not a story that's out of this, you know, I spent some time in Brazil at a wedding with a bunch of kids from hedge funds not long ago. There were several kids in their 20s who made over $5 million last year. And all of it was on financial transactions that didn't, you know, the idea that the GDP of the United States is going to be reduced by taking some of that money from those kids is unsustainable. So on both sides, you know, we got people up on Capitol Hill who won't make a deal because they won't get reelected in the neighborhood that I grew up in if they reduce entitlements. And they won't get elected in the neighborhood that I live in if they raise taxes. And if they don't do both, we're out of business. I guess I'm not supposed to talk about that. I'm supposed to talk about the Middle East. But if we do, yeah, it is. Our ability to deal with it will go up. We need to get smarter, we need to get more efficient, and we're not. Thank you very much for your attention.